Let me tell a story. There was a guy I knew from 3rd grade to 12th grade. This guy was very considerate of what other people were thinking and what they wanted. He was unpopular, skinny, poor, had shoddy clothes, and got bad grades. He was respected by neither the school administration, the athletics, the cool kids, the drama kids, and his college prospects were dim. Not that anyone really disliked him or picked on him, but that nobody really cared for him either. He grew up in a middle-class neighborhood, though I would consider his personal upbringing lower middle class. I don't like using the term class, but hopefully you know what I mean by that. He's now a multimillionaire, having done something big with web design back in that period, and now does something else big. I'm not keeping up with him, and is writing books along the lines of Awaken the Giant Within, and does all these little seminars. He travels all over the world and rubs elbows with the various who's who's, and he's made it big on the market. Now, imagine if there was no market and we lived in a centrally planned economy that just happened to be as productive as the U.S. today. Now, obviously, it wouldn't be as productive. See my post on the USSR for more on that. But let's just imagine an economy like this, and in this economy, one's station in life was determined by academic success through a prescribed job training or intellectual curriculum. If this was the case, then this guy, we'll call him Austin, would be a mailman or something like that instead of a multimillionaire. So when one says they want to have equality or abolish hierarchy, what they really mean is that they want to abolish a certain type of hierarchy, a certain type that they don't like. And of course, hierarchy will still exist. It always and forever will exist and not be diminished. By eliminating one form of hierarchy that occurs in the market, the other criteria of hierarchy fill that gap and become more important. The world becomes more like high school, where people like Austin are nobodies. And people who don't do so well on the market, surprise, surprise, would love to remove that hierarchy and expand the scope of other hierarchies that they do better on. In high school, you have certain students who the administration takes a liking to. They get various free passes and perks. The administration/elite students form an almost homogeneous cluster, and these people decide to a great extent what everyone else forced into the school must do. And these are the type of people who grew up into the media and academic establishment, though most of them peak at high school and go on to do prestigious, if not spectacular things. And I never got along or related with these kinds of people. I know 3 people who made it big on the market, though not nearly as big as the first example, and none of them were involved in that cluster. They got wealthy by finding something that people wanted and providing it at a reasonable price. They chose to provide value and got some profit in return, though on net providing value to society through consumer surplus. Now, if you are an academic, a professor of some sort, you want to influence the state to violently impose policies that satisfy your values. If you are a capitalist, you also want to influence the state to violently impose policies that satisfy your values. When you eliminate the capitalists, who becomes the hierarchy? Who is looked up to and influences others? Athletes, professors, politicians, even entertainers. What happens when someone who started a firm that actually makes your life better in ways you don't even know gives a speech? A rich white male in a suit, smiling and talking about the wonders of the markets. Is he looked up to? No, he is scorned, seen as foolish, childishly naive, lacking in the hardened experience of people who have it rough. On a total market, there are few intergenerational successful capitalists. The way we know this is simple. 1. Critical thinking is largely innate and cannot be taught. I'm just going to assert that that is true, that is a fact, and I'm going to treat that as a fact. Critical thinking cannot be taught. 2. To be a successful capitalist requires terrific critical thinking ability, much more than getting a PhD in political science. This is because profits come from meeting some unmet demand. We're creating something new that people want and being the only company to produce it for a short while, during which period your company booms, before other companies begin to mimic you, and then you find yourself an established player, competing with the other companies on an you know, kind of at an even rate. But the thing is, you have to discover what people want. Because if it was already known what people want, then other companies would be producing it. So you have to uncover demand. You have to come up with something and see if people will like it. It requires creativity. To become a successful capitalist, you have to think of something new, either a new product or a new production process that makes an existing product cheaper. Math, finance management, history, economics, psychology, these can all be taught. Creativity cannot be taught. And by creativity, I mean true creativity, not the pretentious garble of most artists. Sons of rich capitalists can inherit wealth, but they usually cannot manage the company. And so they'll find someone else to manage it and choose to live a lazy trust fund life or become political activists. They may be rich, but they are not capitalists. And I support this practice since the capitalist earned the money, and if he wants to spend it on his son, well, then that's his prerogative. If Bill Gates wanted to give all his money to some hobo, what's the problem? But the question, why is there a race-based income gap and why is there a capitalist gap? And you may think that's quite a leap, but let me go into this and maybe you'll see the connection here. Well, here's the thing. If a project is worth someone's while and they know it, it will be done. If black people are underpaid and underemployed relative to whites, then that is a great business opportunity for a firm to hire more black people, because they'll be able to pay the black people less per unit of value that the black people provide than their white counterparts. And eventually the black labor pool will be bid up and up and up and up. And so when a lot of people are saying that black people are underemployed or understaffed in managerial positions or all that stuff, well, what they're pointing out is that firms are engaging in non-productive hiring practices or non-productive assignment practices. And if that's what they're doing, that is, they're assigning less qualified white people or less able white people to higher positions, then that's a great business opportunity for you. Okay? You start a business and hire all these underemployed and understationed black people, and and it's just ripe for the taking, because these people are very capable, and you can make a whole bunch of money doing that. But of course that's not what's being done. Why then is there still wage inequality in the US? Well, there are 4 general answers. One is the libertarian answer, and that is state intervention allows firms to cartelize, thus new firms can't enter the industry, thus they can all hire white people without worrying about about new diverse firms forming and competing, right? It's so difficult to start a new firm that the incumbent firms don't have to worry about new firms breaking up their good old boy network. The second answer is the anti-capitalist answer, and that is that cartels, right, it's the same thing, it's cartels, but that the cartels are inherent on a free market, and thus firms can cartelize and shut out whoever they want. Right? And this is based on the ahistorical construction of free market monopolies, like the railroad robber barons who got land grants granted by the state. Most people think of that as a free market monopoly. Right? The third explanation for the income gap is the environment answer, and that is that black people are genuinely less productive than white people, okay, but it's because of an array of environmental factors, from womb environment, breastfeeding, school and neighborhood learning environment, and an anti-intellectual culture. All right, so it is in fact that black people are less productive, but it's because of environmental things. And the fourth answer is the genetic answer, that black people are genetically less predisposed to possess the traits relevant to earning income on aggregate. And I am of the position that the reason is mostly number 4, the genetic answer, with some number 3, some environment, but mostly number 4. Most people believe it is entirely number 3, entirely the environment, and a few people believe it's number 1 or number 2. Number 1, the libertarian answer, would require that capitalists across all industries are involved in a racist conspiracy. and let's grant them a cartel, a state-sanctioned cartel. All right, let's grant them that. Each member of the cartel would have an incentive to hire more black people if they were as productive as whites. And so we should see racial income gaps shrinking over time, and in more free markets where the cartel effects are weaker. And yet this is not what we see, so we can dismiss the libertarian answer. And the anti-capitalist answer, that can just be dismissed because cartels don't form in free markets. Okay. Explanation number 3, the environment answer, has much more ideological support and thus many more papers written in its favor than explanation number 4, the genetic answer. In fact, explanation number 4 is to many people unthinkable. But it can be shown very clearly and simply that explanation number 4 assumes the least and has more explanatory power than explanation number 3. Since it is a minority and blackballed position, explanation number 4 has far less quantity published in its favor, but the information is so decisive that this quantitative dearth is easily overcome for anyone who follows the reasoning. Explanation number 4, the genetic answer, is so lacking in financial resources that most of the evidence comes from studies on other topics and, hilariously, from studies attempting to advance explanation number 3. Now, before beginning, I want to say that hereditarianism is definitionally not pseudoscience. Why? Because it's not science. When someone uses the term pseudoscience when talking about race and IQ, that is a dead giveaway that they do not understand the debate and are probably ideologically motivated, because the science is not what is in dispute. Okay, this includes people with PhDs who give speeches at prestigious conferences. If they say pseudoscience, they don't understand the debate. What is in dispute is statistical and deductive analysis. When someone says they are debunking scientific racism or race is pseudoscience, they don't understand what the debate is really about. Sure, science is invoked, but it's not the area of debate. Empirical facts are not what's being disputed. Now, this is going to be a long series, but this is the series that needs to be done. And when you strike the root, you had better be ready for the gates of hell to open unto you. And the sickening feelings this series will evoke in people who buy into the current ideas of equality will cause them to lash out against me, as they have done, in an attempt to make me feel the way I made them feel. And save your energy. It is through talking about this topic that I have learned firsthand what naked beasts men are. The savage dogmatism that can be seen in their eyes. It's not progressive, it's brutal, absolutist, and archonic. Debating, and in some cases physically fighting against people who try to kill me over this topic, has made me a misanthrope. Now, luckily for me, I'm in the U.S., where there is still some support for free expression. However, I don't expect this to last for my entire lifetime, so I need to say this stuff while it's still legal. The next video will be on the history of the concept of measuring psychological traits, or psychometrics, was pioneered, as far as we know, by Francis Galton. Galton had also created the statistical concepts of correlation and applied his statistical methods to measuring human intelligence. He also introduced the use of questionnaires to collect data on human communities, invented the term eugenics as well as the term nature versus nurture, and invented the first weather map. Galton had a cousin who was also fairly bright named Charles Darwin. Cousin Charles's book, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle of Life, spurred Galton into his investigations of heredity and intelligence and later eugenics. The general idea at the time was that humanity had a small number of geniuses and invalids, but the great lot of humanity was scattered in the middle. Galton strongly disagreed with this view a priori, and following the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859, Galton devoted much of the rest of his life to studying human variation in various physical and mental characteristics. Lambert Adolphe Jacques Quetelet, I don't know how to pronounce that, I'm just going to say Quetelet, pioneered the concept of the normal distribution, which is that for a given trait, the human population tends toward a middle, with less on either extreme end for a given trait. For example, height. Most people within a given population are close to the median height of a population with really tall or short people at either end, and this forms a bell curve, like a curve kind of shaped like a bell, like people at either end are less numerous. Alfred Binet was appointed by the French government in 1904 to be part of a commission to devise a method of sorting children into educational classes based on ability, as the French government had recently passed a law forcing children to attend schooling centers from ages 6 to 14. In 1905, with the help of a student named Theodore Simon, Binet and Simon developed the Binet-Simon scale. The scale was designed to sort children into special needs and all that stuff. On the scale, Alfred Binet stressed that the patterns of intelligence were diverse and required qualitative, not just quantitative, study. Binet also pointed out that intellectual development progressed at different rates for different people. Some were late bloomers, and that intelligence could be influenced by environmental factors. Therefore, intelligence was not based solely on genetics, was malleable rather than fixed, and could only be measured in children with comparable backgrounds. In 1908, Henry Herbert Goddard found utility in the Binet-Simon test as a way of demonstrating the superiority of the white race. Hearing how his tests were being used in 1909, Binet wrote, this is Alfred Binet, he says, "Some recent philosophers seem to have given their moral approval to these deplorable verdicts that affirm that the intelligence of an individual is a fixed quantity, a quantity that cannot be augmented. We must protest and react against this brutal pessimism. We will try to demonstrate that it is founded on nothing." Now, I believe Binet was strawmanning Goddard a little bit, but that's a little bit of an aside. In 1916, Stanford psychologist Louis Terman created the Stanford revision of the Binet-Simon scale, or Stanford-Binet for short. Terman worked with his graduate students, removing terms and adding new ones so that the scale could be used on adults. Of the test, Terman wrote, quote, "It is safe to predict that in the near future intelligence tests will bring tens of thousands of high-grade defectives under the surveillance and protection of society. This will ultimately result in curtailing the reproduction of feeble-mindedness and in the elimination of an enormous amount of crime, pauperism, and industrial inefficiency. The time is probably not far distant when intelligence tests will become recognized and widely used and a widely used instrument for determining vocational fitness. When thousands of children who have been tested by the Binet scale have been followed out into the industrial world and their success in various occupations noted, we shall know fairly definitely the minimum intelligence quotient necessary for success in each leading occupation." And yes, Louis Terman coined the term intelligence quotient upon the release of the Stanford-Binet test. In 1917, the U.S. Army was entering World War I and needed a way to stratify the recruits into officers and grunts. And the U.S. was in an odd position in that they were a really big population, right? Large industrial base, lots of people, but their army was really small, and so they needed to build a really big army really quick. And so they didn't have time to spend months in training and exercising and allow the competent men to rise to the top of the officer corps organically. Right? They needed an officer corps immediately. And the president of the American Psychological Association, Robert Yerkes, at the behest of the U.S. Army, developed from the Stanford-Binet the Army Alpha for literate recruits and the Army Beta for illiterate recruits. David Wechsler was born to a Jewish family in 1896 in Romania. His family emigrated to the U.S., and in 1925 he earned his Ph.D. In 1932, he became the chief psychologist at the Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital. He found the Stanford-Binet intelligence test inadequate and formed his own in 1939 called the Wechsler-Bellevue Intelligence Test. He then developed the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, or WISC, in 1949, and the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence in 1967. But that's not very important. The WISC is what's more important. In 1955, he revised the Wechsler-Bellevue test and renamed it the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which was then revised in 1981 and referred to as the WAIS-R, or the WAIS revision. and then revised in 1997, referred to as the WAIS 3. WAIS stands for Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. So the history of IQ testing is less than glamorous and has been used to advance caste systems, forcing individuals in particular stations in life, and forced sterilization based on a single test score. This is not something I advocate, nor have I ever advocated. IQ is often a mismeasure of man, if not taken with a hefty grain of salt, but it is an excellent measure of men, plural. Let's say you gave two men, Bob and James, a vocabulary test. You know nothing about these two men except that they have the capacity to take a vocabulary test. Bob scores a 6 out of 10, James scores a 5 out of 10. Who is smarter, Bob or James? Well, if I was forced to choose, I would say that Bob is smarter. And by that I mean, if both Bob and James were subjected to a battery of tests regarding the brain, Bob would most likely do better than James. And I would say the probability of Bob doing better than James is somewhere around 50.000001% or something like that, which is still virtually a coin toss. An analogy would be that if Bob could bench press 1 pound more than James, I would predict that Bob could squat more than James if I was forced to predict. But I wouldn't put much stock in this prediction, much more than a coin toss. And like the vocabulary test, the bench press is affected by the specific conditions of the time of measurement. If Bob had one higher IQ point on an IQ test, I would predict that Bob would do better on a math test than James if I was forced to predict. But again, I wouldn't put much more stock in Bob doing better. If James studied for 5 minutes, then that would probably be more important than that one IQ point. Now, let us presume we had a slightly better measure. Let's say Bob could bench press 270 pounds and James could bench press 240 pounds. I would then predict Bob could also squat more than James, but I wouldn't be shocked if James could actually squat more than Bob. Now, let's work with something closer to what we're dealing with IQ. Let's say you have Group A, 1,000 people who can bench press 270 pounds, and Group B, 1,000 people who can bench press 240 pounds. Given this information, we can be virtually certain that Group A, on average, can also squat more than Group B. Similarly, if Group A is 1,000 people who scored an average 6 out of 10 on a vocabulary test, and Group B, which is 1,000 people who scored a 5 out of 10 on the same vocabulary test, we can be virtually certain that Group A would do better on a math test on average than Group B, assuming some correlation between math and vocabulary ability. That is, assuming a general intelligence factor, just as I was assuming something of a general strength factor when assuming that people who can bench press more also tend to be able to squat more. And that's true. General strength factor, that's true. People like Arthur Jensen, Charles Murray, Richard Herrnstein, they go into detail as to why IQ tests are per se valuable. And that's important to them because they are interested in individuals. I'm not interested in that. In fact, the specific mental test is not very important to me as long as it is not systematically biased, because I am not interested in individuals. I am interested in Group A and Group B. And with these large aggregates, certain spontaneities wash out. If a score on an IQ test has merely a 0.01 correlation with income, but this test is totally unbiased, that's all I need to make my case. I'm interested in the ecological correlation, and the reason is political. There are income gaps along broad racial lines, and so my interest is to show that these broad income gaps can be attributed to broad genetic differences. I'm not out to attack you or say that you are doomed because of your genes. For example, Einstein was certainly much smarter than his parents at a genetic level. IQ generally correlates with income. According to Arthur Jensen, it's 0.4, and according to Daniel Seligman, it's 0.5. So if Group A has 1,000 people with a median IQ of 100, and Group B has 1,000 people with a median IQ of 85, we can be virtually certain that Group A will earn more income than Group B. The median IQ of the group Black people is 85, while the median IQ of the group White people is 100. And there are many more than 1,000 people in each example. And not surprisingly, white people make significantly more in the U.S. than black people in the U.S. But when controlled for IQ, aggregate black and white income is the same. This disproves the libertarian and anti-capitalist theories of income inequality, as it is clearly a difference in productive capacity as proxied by IQ somehow that produces income inequality. And I'm going to have a little link here that shows some more correlations with IQ scores. Apparently, job performance, however measured, there's a bit of subjectivity to how you measure job or what criteria you use to measure job performance. But apparently, job performance correlates better with a single IQ score than the height of a parent and a child. So that's interesting. I will suppose the high IQ, whatever cognitive traits high IQ entails, that's what causes the difference in performance, as I can't imagine the difference in performance causing the high IQs, because action is done by pre-existing things. There is no earning of income without something to earn it. And none of these facts here are disputed, so I can keep this video short. This is basic Wikipedia info. So what we see is that one score on an IQ test is a decent predictor of income for individuals in a given political unit, and a rock-solid predictor for aggregates. I haven't shown anything in the way of genetic causation yet. I'm just laying the foundation of what IQ is and what needs to be shown. The Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study was run by Sandra Scarr, who before the study was what I would call an equalitarian. She wanted to take black, mulatto, and white children and have them adopted by white parents and compare them to a control of non-adopted white children to see the effects of a environment that was equalized to her satisfaction. The test was run by an equalitarian with the intent of disproving the notion that there was a significant genetic component to the black-white IQ gap. In this, I will have a link to just the Wikipedia page on the study that goes into the study in more detail. Anyway, she was not able to secure the necessary funding from academia, but the Pioneer Fund, a pro-eugenics organization that supported the Nazis in the 1930s and 1940s, gave Scarr the funding she wanted. Lots of organizations supported the Nazis when they were popular, and from what I know about the Pioneer Fund, I support their efforts to fund politically incorrect studies like this one. Furthermore, it was Sandra Scarr who was running the study. She just got the money from another organization. Now, I will... the reason I believe that Scarr did not get funding from academia is because, quote, academia, wherever she was trying to get the money from, knew exactly what the results of a study like this would be and did not want to fund that kind of research. But Sandra Scarr was a true believer and believed that, deep research would reveal equality. The Pioneer Fund believed otherwise and was very willing to fund such a study, and so they did. And today, the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study is, in my estimation, the single best piece of evidence against equalitarianism. I want to keep this a little thing short. With the internet, the specifics of the study are not hard to find, but here are the results. At age 7, the adopting parents had an IQ of 120 in the study. Non-adopted white children, that is the control group, had an IQ of 117. Adopted whites had an IQ of 112. Adopted mulattoes had an IQ of 109, and adopted blacks had an IQ of 97. This is at age 7. When the children in this study were at age 17, the parents had an IQ of 115. The non-adopted whites had an IQ of 109. That is the control group. The adopted whites had an IQ of 106. The adopted mulattoes had an IQ of 99, and the adopted blacks had an IQ of 89. So that is, it was whites with mulattoes in the middle, blacks at the bottom, as one would as a hereditarian would predict. That is exactly as the genetic hypothesis would predict. Scar and her colleague Richard Weinberg interpreted the results as supporting an environment-only hypothesis. This is where this gets really funny. And made methodological critiques to their own study, claiming that pre-adoption factors confounded racial ancestry. It is noteworthy that these methodological critiques of their own studies weren't stated until 1994 in response to Richard Lynn, 18 years after it was first published. There have been other adoption studies involving black and white subjects, but they were not designed to determine a genetic component of the overarching black-white IQ gap, but to solve smaller issues such as whether the effect of having a white mother, black father versus black mother, white father, which of those would be better in terms of IQ. And so the samples were not selected to be representative or random. But what you will notice about these studies, such as the Baltimore study or the Eifforth study, and the Eifforth study can kind of, the significance of that can be debunked in by just looking at gene amplification. But anyway, the significance, what you notice about these studies is that you can get black-white IQ gaps that are really small. Like you can get samples such as the IQ gaps are really small, or even find situations with blacks scoring a little bit higher than the whites. But what you don't see are black populations being a standard deviation higher than white populations. All right, it's imperative that you watch this series in its entirety as each section builds on the other. This topic isn't very complicated, but it does require that you know what's going on. Otherwise, you're apt to misunderstand and overblow what is being said. The heritability of IQ. When I first looked at the Wikipedia page on heritability of IQ, I didn't expect much, so I was pleasantly surprised to see how balanced their article is. So I'll just copy-pasta a section verbatim from Wikipedia. They say, the study of the heritability of IQ is a field of research that includes biology, genomics, psychology, philosophy, sociology, and anthropology. Heritability is a measure of the relative contribution of genotype to the variation of a phenotype in a given group in a specific environment. But heritability of a trait in a particular population does not set any limit on how malleable the trait is under changes of environment, because, quote, even highly heritable traits can be strongly manipulated by the environment, so heritability has little, if anything, to do with controllability, close quote. The debate about IQ heritability touches on the nature versus nurture divide, and there has been significant controversy in the academic community about it ever since research began in the 19th century. Most of the heritable variance in IQ appears to be carried by the general intelligence factor, or G, which is like the general strength factor I've talked about before. IQ is a polygenic trait under normal circumstances, according to some researchers. However, destructive mutation of individual genes associated with development can severely affect intelligence, with phenylketonuria as an example. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I know what phenylethylene is, but I don't know if I pronounced ketonuria correct. Estimates in the academic research of the heritability of IQ have varied from below 0.5 to a high of 0.9, or 90% and 50%. A general range of 0.4 to 0.8 was given by the Mainstream Science on Intelligence, close quote, a 1994 declaration of 52 scientists in the field. A 1996 statement by the American Psychological Association gave about 0.45 heritability for children and 0.75 heritability during and after adolescence. Now, this difference in heritability at different ages in life, that's going to be a topic of another video. It's very, that's actually a piece of evidence for a genetic, well, I'll go into it later. Anyway, the article continues. A 2004 meta-analysis of reports and current directions in psychological science gave an overall estimate of around 0.85 for 18-year-olds and older. The New York Times Magazine has listed about 3/4 as a figure held by the majority of studies. End quote. Wonderful. Now, just to clarify, when they say a trait is 0.85 or 0.75 heritable, that means genetic similarity to the parent explains 85% of the variation within a population in a particular environment. Again, this is important. Let me illustrate why. Let's say you have 100 people and are able to construct perfectly identical environments. Now, this is, of course, impossible, but let's just imagine the theoretical construct of a perfectly identical environment. Any variation in IQ in this perfectly identical environment could then be ascribed to genetic factors. Simply put, and I'll address the Luton and gene-environment interaction in a later post, this is the case. And so in a perfectly controlled environment, heritability would be 100%. When they say that IQ is 0.85 heritable, they mean it is 0.85 heritable within the environments that these studies were done. That is, there are some environmental differences in the U.S., right? That's true, but they're not very substantial. In sub-Saharan Africa, on the other hand, you're dealing with things like malnutrition, early childhood diseases, war, illiteracy, right? And those things impact IQ a lot. Because environments are so radically disparate in Africa, right? Because, I mean, the difference between starving and not starving may only be, $2,000, but it's, it's a huge difference in brain development. Because of that, the heritability within Africa is much lower than the heritability within the U.S. Yeah. And differences in environment, such as having enough food and medicine, play an extremely large role in sub-Saharan Africa. Much more than in the U.S., I mean. In a poor society where things like disease, illiteracy, and malnutrition played more of a role, people could grow their intellect by leaps and bounds by learning to read, getting a proper diet, and curing disease. So being learned separated one from the commoner much more, like a long time ago, than it does today. The fact that the learned literally spoke a different language, Latin, it literally divided them, it literally divided them into two different worlds in a way that it is difficult for us to understand. That is a topic for another post. And when I say literally divided them, like they were literate and the commoners were not literate, they spoke a different language, the commoners spoke another language. So yeah, it was a literal divide. Okay. Not beating that dead horse. I believe more detail is in order on this. There was an excellent study done by Bouchard. Anyway, I linked to the study itself, but I forgot the name of the guy who managed the study. It was a bunch of people, but he was the main guy who did this. It was the Minnesota Twin Studies in 1979. And anyway, what they found in the study was that, before going over the results of the study, when a person takes an IQ test twice, there was a correlation between the two scores of 0.87 for them taking the test twice. So, what do I mean by this? Like, let's say you take an IQ test one day, and then you take an IQ test another day. You may be feeling better one day. You may be more focused one day. On the other day, you may have like a bunch of other things on your mind, and so you don't do as well in the IQ test. Right? And because of all these factors, there's only a 0.87 correlation for a person taking the same IQ test twice. It's not a 1-to-1 correlation. Okay. Anyway, the result of the Minnesota twin study was that monozygotic or identical twins who are reared together by the same parents have a 0.86 correlation in their IQ scores in the test taken one time. And that's compared to a 0.87 for the same person taking the same test twice. So it's almost completely identical. Now, for identical twins who are reared apart, that is, one twin is in one family, one twin is in the other family, the correlation is only 0.76. The correlation for non-identical twins who are reared together, who are reared in the same family, that correlation is 0.55. And the correlation for biological siblings who are not twins reared together, that's 0.47. The correlation between parents and children living together is 0.4. The correlation between parents and children living apart, biological parents and the children living apart, is 0.31. The correlation between biological siblings who are reared apart is 0.24. And the correlation between adopted children living together is 0. If you adopt a child and bring him into a new family, the correlation in IQs of the adopted child and the biological child is 0 compared to the rest of the population within the United States. And of course, the correlation between unrelated people living apart, that's the baseline. That's set to 0. So it's important to note that there's some random variation in score, about 0.13 in an individual taking an IQ test. So even if we had two completely identical gene sets in completely identical environment, we would only expect a correlation of about 0.87. So if we divide each of the correlations by 0.87, right, to factor in the randomness, we get a much clearer result, right? When controlling for the random variation in taking an IQ test, the identical twins reared apart have a correlation of 0.99. The identical twins reared together have a correlation of 0.99. The identical twins reared apart have a correlation of 0.87. The non-identical twins reared together have a correlation of 0.83. And you can click on the link and see the results yourself, and you can do all this yourself, right? Make sure I'm not making anything up. Okay. For a more visceral understanding of just how high these correlations are, the height correlation between parents and children is about 0.47, whereas the IQ correlation of twins reared apart is 0.76. So the correlation of IQ for identical twins reared apart is higher than the correlation of height between parents and their offspring. Obviously, one can go into a great deal of depth on this, but I'm not interested in that. The correlations are high enough, and even if you can find studies that place twins in a wider range of environments and thus show weaker correlations, right? Because like sub-Saharan Africa, right? Wider range of environments is going to raise the heritability. That matters very little to me, because the reason is that as long as identical twins reared apart, as long as that correlation remains statistically significant, that's all I need on this front. Genetic differences between races. Right off the bat, let's nip a few fallacies in the bud. One fallacy is, races are decided by us. At one point, people called English people a race and Danish people a race, and said Irish people were a different race, and said horrible things about the Irish. Race is a purely social construct. And that's true, sort of. Okay, let me explain. First off, the existence of poor categorizations in the past is not an argument against categorization today. Second off, race is as much a social construct as mountains or hills are a social construct. There are visible behavioral differences between populations called races, right? And there are visible differences between what we call hills and what we call mountains. Are there ambiguous cases? Sure. Of course, race is not a solid thing any more than a forest is a solid thing. It's a general basket of tendencies that cluster geographically at one point in history. Though once the geography breaks down, the categorization will change, and when the great mixing accelerates, the categorization will be eliminated, and there will be no more race, blah, whatever. So it's just a category, like a hill or a mountain. So are categories social constructs? Well, sort of, I guess. Another fallacy. There's more genetic variation within populations than between. I get this a lot, and I'm always a bit surprised when people say this. Aside from the relevance of variation and how measurement is done, this is a red herring. Like, there is certainly more variation in muscular composition within BCS and FCS college football divisions, and for those who don't know, those are the upper and lower Division I football divisions. Okay, anyway, BCS has better players than FCS, but there's certainly more body composition differences within the BCS and the FCS than between them. So what? BCS players are still better on aggregate. And I haven't checked this, but I imagine there's more height and weight variation within the genders than between them. Okay? Men are still taller and bigger. So, another fallacy here that a lot of people will say is that the genetic differences between what we call races are really, really small. Or another variation is that the genetic variation that separates all humans is really, really small. It's a very small percentage. So, and this argument stems from the deeper problem of counting genes. The argument is like, Bob and James are 99.99% similar. That's not enough difference to account for their performance differences. But a variation in a single gene is enough to cause severe disorders or special abilities in a person. In reality, 100 allele frequency variations is enough, and allele frequency is the variation in a gene. In theory, something like 100 gene allele frequencies could account for all observable differences. Okay? There doesn't need to be that much difference in order to have visibly different populations. And more importantly, there are many ways to measure genetic difference. If you were to just find what genes white people had and what genes black people had, you would find very little difference. But when you count the allele frequencies, you will find much more variation. Sure, both blacks and whites have a gene for eye color, and so in that sense they're the same. But whites have different allele frequencies. More have blue and green eyes. Not that I think eye color is important, but it illustrates the principle. Sure, there are some black people with blue eyes, but it's much more common for white people. And it is these different allele frequencies that cause politically relevant performance differences. Just an aside here. In theory, there could be another species of man which had twice as many chromosomes as us and registered a whopping 50% difference. Which is more than our difference with jellyfish, if I recall correctly. So you could have someone who looks just like a human, but has twice as many chromosomes as us. And however, the information in this chromosome, loaded to the brim with junk DNA, could produce men indistinguishable from, say, Middle Easterners. And it would be a great mystery for thousands of years why they couldn't breed with, quote, other humans, close quote. Only when the DNA was analyzed would it be realized that other humans are more closely related to canines than to this apparently human population. So that's kind of how, that's just a little illustration of how irrelevant total genetic data is. 'Cause in theory, you could have someone who looks exactly like us, but be as genetically similar to us as a jellyfish. Okay. And we can further illustrate the folly of counting genes by comparing two physically very similar populations, Papua New Guineans and, quote, East Africans, close quote. Now, these populations appear similar and have very similar physiologies, with similar shaped noses that disperse heat, and black skin that isn't burned so easily, and more sweat glands than populations that evolve in colder climates, right? And these are all just adaptations to a hot climate. Now, Papua New Guineans and East Africans, if we were to just count genes, are farther from each other than East Africans are from Europeans. But they look so similar. How can this be? Well, there are a lot of genes that don't sequence proteins, and in fact most don't. And there is some junk DNA that doesn't appear to do anything at all. There can be huge differences in the ABCTs when we peek at the DNA through both, even though populations appear very similar. East Africans and Papua New Guineans have genetic similarities in terms of allele frequencies that visibly affect, which makes sense since they evolved in similar environments. Another illustration of the silliness of counting genes is in breeds of domesticated dogs. There is more variation among the races of man than among breeds of dogs. But how can this be? The breeds of dogs appear so much more different from each other than the races of man are. Well, by our subjective perception, they are. But if you count genes, humans are more different. This is because domesticated dogs have been intensively bred, and so there's little genetic drift that affects junk DNA, and most of the variation is in genes that produce visible traits, which is all that is politically relevant. Last in this section, we should look at the allele frequencies on the gene DTNBP1, and by that I mean you got to click on the link in the description in order to see what the hell I'm talking about. There's a little picture down by the post. It's pretty obvious. You'll see it. But yeah, there's a bunch of data here, and I could try to describe it verbally, but you need to just look at it. Okay. Half Sigma assembled a nice little chart based on data from the HapMap project. Forget what that stands for. Human something palpable type, I don't know. But anyway, it shows the correlation that certain uncommon alleles have for the gene DTNBP1 that they had with IQ. And there were Nigerians, some Dutch people, and some Japanese people in this study, and they found the uncommon allele correlations with effects on IQ. Now, the way this was disambiguated is that the uncommon alleles had similar effects within populations. So it had similar effects within the Nigerian and within the Dutch population. That is, for example, the presence of uncommon allele C on the SNP RS760761 had similar effects on both Nigerians and Dutch. And so Nigerians without the uncommon allele tended to have higher IQs than Nigerians with the uncommon allele. So it impacted within populations. That's what's important. So this isn't just Group A has a higher IQ, Group A has different genes, therefore the genes cause it, and here are the correlations. No, that's not what is done. It was disambiguated. The uncommon alleles are found to impact within populations. Now there are problems with this example. That is, the sample size is small, and the polygenetic effects haven't been controlled for. Like, they haven't controlled for, like, for example, the presence of the uncommon allele RS2619528. We look at that and we see, oh, look, it drops IQ by minus 6.41. But does the presence of that allele, how much of that really is just a coincidental with the presence of another allele? Right. So, for example, the presence of one allele, may cause or may just be very commonly coincidental with another allele, and so the impact of that allele isn't really an impact of that in and of itself. It's just that it's happens to be present when this other allele is present, and it's that other allele that's doing all the impacting. I don't know if I explained that very good. Anyway, this study is not definitive. So while this little example doesn't prove that the black-white IQ gap is caused by genetics, or it doesn't even prove the apparent portion in the sample, it does show that certain alleles appear to impact whatever IQ measures, and that these allele frequencies vary from population to population. The analysis of DTNBP1 does, in addition to everything else stated in this post, decisively put genetics back on the table as a viable explanation for some or most of the aggregate population differences in IQ. And that's what this shows, right? It doesn't show the gaps between these populations are caused by genes definitively, but what it does show definitively is that genes matter in IQ. So, anyway, you can say that race doesn't exist in the same way you can choose to call an elevation of Earth a mountain or a hill or not, or choose to classify an area as a forest or wooded grassland or not. The debate over the existence of race is asinine. There is genetic variation, and you can call this genetic variation race or not. Some people choose not to, and that's fine. That's their preference. Unfortunately, these people are trying to make their classification systems, all of which are inherently subjective, out to be something objective. they don't use race, and so they're trying to say like objectively this taxonomy doesn't exist. It's stupid. It forgets how categorization works. For example, one could categorize Kenyans and Japanese as a race, and the Hutus and Vietnamese as another race, and using height as the criteria for categorization. I wouldn't find this to be very useful, but it's not incorrect to do this because it's just a category that they're choosing to use. I think it's dumb. I think it doesn't explain much, but I can't say it's wrong. And because of this, black and white, I use the term black and white, these are fine categories, even though they're just colors. Like they're fine. They're different populations with visible systematic genetic differences and are politically very distinct. And while black and white are just colors, people understand what I mean when I say black and white, right? And that's the whole point of words. They know, like when I say a black person, they know I mean more than just the skin color. Like if you've ever seen a picture of like an albino black person, they look different from white people. Okay, so we know what the debate is about. It's about aggregates, and we know that IQ is rather important, and we know that genetics are a possible answer. The next post will begin the main event, which will probably lead to much wailing and gnashing. In each of these little videos, I link to the article that I am reading from, or the little section that I'm reading from, and so you can go back and look at what I'm reading from, so you can backtrack and do whatever you need to do. It makes it easier. But in this, you kind of have to go look at this now, because it is a really long list with a bunch of numbers, and it has a bunch of numbers, and I'm saying a whole lot of stuff. Like I'd be saying like North Asian Koreans in Belgium 110, North Asians in Hong Kong 108, North Asians in Singapore 108. Right? I'd be saying that for quite a bit, and I don't think verbally you would be able to comprehend all of that being said. So you just have to go there and look. And so I'm assuming you've gone ahead and read that. Now, when looking at this broad arc of data, it jumps out at me that both genes and environment play a role. Indians in India are at 82, while Indians in the UK are at 96. Africans in Africa cluster around 71, while Africans in the UK at 87, and Africans in the US are at 85. Americans, and when I say Americans, I'm meaning broadly what people mean by Native Americans or Amerindians. I'm not referring to citizens of the United States. I'm constructing a quote racial close quote category, and I'm calling it Americans. It's my categorical construct. Anyway, Americans in Peru score 87, while Americans in the U.S. score 94, and Americans in Canada score 97. It seems as if living in the U.S. lowers one's IQ by just a few points compared to living in other European majority states, as UK whites score below, as US whites score below UK whites and Canadian whites. US blacks score below UK blacks, and I would imagine Canadian blacks, and US Americans score less than Canadian Americans. Europeans or / white people in poor countries like South Africa, which is at 94, Bulgaria at 93, Serbia at 89, and Croatia at 90, also score a bit lower. Ireland is odd, given that it is not a poor country, and Ireland is at 92, if I recall. It is not a poor country, and I don't want to immediately jump to a genetic difference conclusion and say that, well, it must be as a result of genetics as to why the Irish IQ number is so low, but I would not rule it out, or it could just be an unrepresentative sample. I'm not sure what the situation is with Ireland. It could be genetics. I would not rule that out. It could be environment. Wouldn't rule that out either. But given that the environmental differences between Africans in Africa and Africans in the U.S. only produces a 14-point increase, that is, going from Africa to the U.S. only produces a 14. There's only a 14-point gap between U.S. blacks and African blacks. How plausible is it that that environmental difference between blacks and whites in the U.S. would produce a 15-point gap? Is the environmental difference between U.S. whites and U.S. blacks really so huge that it can account for a 15-point gap when the difference in environment between blacks in Africa and blacks in the U.S. only produces a 14-point gap? Especially keeping in mind that the purchasing power of blacks in the U.S. is higher than almost any European population, or at least at the time I wrote this. That may not be true in a few years, but at the time I wrote this, that was indeed true. And of course, the Europeans in those white people in those European countries score higher IQs than whites in the U.S., despite having a lower purchasing power than blacks in the U.S. It's not that there are large gaps between populations that impressed me. Right? I expected that, but that they cluster so tightly. It seems as if there are thresholds, and when Europeans cross the poverty threshold, they end up at around 89, right? Which is, Serbia. Americans, or Amerindians or whatever, when they cross the poverty threshold, they end up at 84. Non-European Caucasians are also at 84, and Africans crash down to 71. When they cross the quote wealthy close quote threshold, Europeans are at around 100, Americans and non-European Caucasians at 95, and Africans at 85, and there doesn't seem to be much in between these two thresholds. That is, there seems to be wealthy countries and not wealthy countries, and it's kind of a dichotomy. And on one side of the dichotomy, you can expect, quote, white people to have a certain aggregate IQ, and on the other side of the dichotomy, you can expect white people to have another aggregate IQ, and same is for all of the other races that we construct. Now, it's hard to tell the effects of grinding poverty grinding poverty has on large European populations, because there is no large European population that is really, really poor. That is, the Europeans in Africa, for example, tend to be a little bit wealthier than the blacks in Africa. And so my 89 number is kind of a guesstimation. Of course, there is an interaction, right? Populations with low IQs tend to oppose free markets, and I'll have a little link there that shows this. I mean, this is just an empirical fact. Whether or not you believe it's causation is another issue, but it is just it is true. It is an empirical fact. That is the case, and tend to support greater state control. The greater state control reduces income and thus ability to develop one's brain, which then breeds a population that clamors for even more state control, right? And I like to call this the cycle of stupidity. Time magazine did a review of Arthur Jensen's book Bias in Mental Testing in 1979. In it, the writer summarized Jensen's findings. First, he says, the argument that whites do better than blacks because they have larger vocabularies is wrong. In fact, blacks do slightly better on verbal tests than on nonverbal ones. The second point is that IQ tests, both verbal and nonverbal, are not expressions of white culture that penalize blacks. Surprisingly, blacks do better on culture-loaded tests than on culture-fair tests that are carefully constructed to root out references more familiar to middle-class whites than to blacks. Third point was that the idea that culture-fair tests framed by whites will inevitably favor whites is also wrong. In a Japanese language version of the U.S. conceived Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, Japanese youngsters outscored American whites by an average of 6 points. I believe that the tests are not biased, but this little piece of evidence here does not prove that, because it could be that the tests are biased against Japanese children, but Japanese children are so much smarter that they end up scoring 6 points ahead anyway, and that theoretically if the tests were not biased they would actually end up scoring 10 points ahead. I don't believe this is the case, but this little piece of evidence does not. This little piece of evidence is not evidence for non-bias. The other two are, but this third point is not. Okay, back to the article. Fourth point, major tests used by schools, employers, and armed forces are very accurate in predicting future success or failure for native-born English-speaking Americans. That's a very important point. The fifth point was that when white and black children have equal socioeconomic status are tested, whites score an average of 12 IQ points higher than blacks. All right, end of the summary. Now that last point is that when socioeconomic status is the same, the black children are only 12 points as opposed to 15 points lower than whites. One may be tempted to automatically ascribe these 3 points to the change in environment that a higher socioeconomic status is, however they're defining it. But black people in wealthier environments, on par with whites, could have some genetic characteristic that results in their higher socioeconomic status. And so what I'm saying is that the 3-point closing when socioeconomic status is controlled for could be a genetic difference, right? And that is, rich blacks could be genetically distinct from poor blacks in a way relevant to earning income, just as rich whites are probably genetically distinct from poor whites if we were to break populations down along those lines. Another thing to point out is that SAT scores actually overpredict black performance. That is, a black student tends to do worse than a white student for any given SAT score. And this may be due to the institutional racism at universities like Harvard that accept blacks ahead of more qualified whites. And what this does is it forces these blacks into an environment which they're not suited for. But that is just my theory. The point, though, is that the SAT tests are not culturally biased against blacks by any reasonable measure. They are, however, biased in another way, and let me explain. All tests have a bias toward something. A math test is biased toward math proficiency. If a test were to predict income earning potential, it would only be relevant to a specific culture. And maybe culture is not the right word, but let's go with it. Thus, to be a good predictor of income, it must be biased toward the culture in which the income is to be earned. Or we could say more generally, in order to be a good predictor of income, it must be biased toward the behaviors requisite to earn income in a given area. And I believe that these behaviors are somewhat universal. An IQ test that is not culturally biased is worthless. Thus, cultural bias can be good or bad depending on what you are interested in. Let's say IQ tests are culturally biased in favor of, quote, white culture, close quote, and that's fine. Since IQ predicts income so well, that would suggest that it's good for income to embrace, quote, white culture, right? the IQ tests are doing their job. It's good. They are biased in favor of white culture. That's good. You should embrace white culture so you'll earn more money. Okay. That said, the evidence suggests that IQ tests are not biased against U.S. blacks, but they would be biased against, say, an illiterate hunter-gatherer. Now, a cute test, and I use cute kind of pejoratively, that is used to illustrate cultural bias is the bitch test, or the black intelligence test of cultural homogeneity. And this test used language used by U.S. blacks on it. And surprise, surprise, blacks tended to perform better on this test than whites. Right? It used a lot of terms prevalent among black people, broadly speaking. But do you see why this is relevant? The bitch test is a test biased in favor of language and terms that blacks used, and thus blacks perform better than whites on this test. Okay, right, it was an openly biased test. This is not evidence that the Wechsler and Stanford-Binet tests are biased in favor of whites. Right? That is, this test being biased in favor of blacks does not mean that other tests are biased in favor of whites. That is just because the bitch... Yeah, I already said that. Furthermore, mainline IQ test and SAT test companies attempt to eliminate bias. So, at most, we're dealing with minimal implicit bias. That is unintentional bias. And so it is limited in that way. Although I don't think that exists at all. Gene amplification or gene expression. Another argument put forward is how the black-white IQ gap widens with age. And the argument is that this must be a result of accumulating environmental impacts because obviously the genes don't change, but the IQ gap between blacks and whites is widening with age, so it must be an accumulation of environment. Right? But really it's evidence for the opposite. Genes get more important with age, not less important. Human babies are very similar. You'll notice of all types, boys and girls, obvious example. And chicken and human embryos are also rather similar, but as they begin to develop, they begin to appear and act much more differently. A good example of gene amplification would be when Winthrop Niles Kellogg adopted a chimpanzee named Gua and raised it alongside his son Donald. Gua used glasses and silverware better than Donald, responded to verbal commands better than Donald, and could walk before Donald. Toward the end of the experiment, which lasted 9 months, Donald was starting to pull away from Gua and was clearly becoming smarter than Gua. He was starting to do things better. He was responding to commands better than Gua. I don't think he was able to walk as well as Gua throughout the length of the study. But the human was beginning to pull away from the chimp. And so the genes began to be expressed through the development. Right? Gene amplification can also be noticed in how people tend to have lighter features when they are younger. Since darker features tend to be dominant, not recessive, as genes become more expressed, the person will have darker features. Another example would be how boys become men and girls become women later on, or how how tom girls are mostly a pre-puberty phenomenon, and of course the black-white IQ gap widens with age. If you don't understand heritability, then the Flynn effect could seem like a death blow to hereditarianism. All the Flynn effect shows is that questions answered correctly on IQ tests have risen over a long period of time. Now, given that their heritability is measured at 0.85 in the US, we shall presume, or at 85% heritable, this seems odd. If IQ scores are so influenced by genetics, how can they rise so precipitously over a long period of time? Well, let's bring back our good friends Bob and James. We placed Bob and James in America in 1800. At age 18, we administered to both of them a test. Bob scores a 60 out of 100 on the test, and James scores a 50 out of 100 on the test. Now let's place them in America in 1900. At age 18, we administer them both a test. Bob scores a 70 out of 100, and James scores a 60 out of 100. Now let's place Bob and James in America in the year 2000. At age 18, we administer both of them a test. Bob scores an 80 out of 100, and James scores a 70 out of 100. So you can see that the scores of both Bob and James have risen when placed in different time periods that I made up, but the 10-question gap has not changed. And we're assuming that the test has not changed, and this will be important to debunk another claim in another video or another section here. It's actually a bit more complicated than this, right? Because an IQ score is actually a ranking. So let's say blacks on average answer 10 more questions correctly in 20 years, but whites only answer 5 more questions correctly. It is possible that the IQ gap would remain exactly the same if the rankings of individuals didn't change. Right? That is, let's say third place gets 10 correctly, fourth place gets 5 correctly, third place then answers 1 more question correctly, and fourth place answers 5 more questions correctly. The average observer would say, well, obviously fourth place gained on third place, but the ranking is still the same, right? And so in an IQ score, no change would be recorded. Okay. Think of it like a single file line of people, and everyone in the line moves forward. This line is a mix of blacks and whites, with more whites at the front and more blacks at the back. If the people in the lower half all move 2 steps forward, and people in the front half move 1 step forward, it is possible that not a single person in the lower half would overtake a single person in the upper half, and thus the IQ gap would not change. Even if some people in the lower half overtook some people in the upper half, there are still plenty of white people in the lower half, and so the black-white IQ gap wouldn't narrow very much then. To go even deeper, it is possible that a narrowing of the the narrowing of the gap between the lower half and the upper half, it's possible that will result in a widening of the black-white IQ gap, even if whites scored higher on average, right? This is because the very top of the lower half could be all white, and the very bottom of the upper half could be all black. And so if the lower half progresses on the upper half, then it would just be white people overtaking black people, even though it was more white people at the very front of the whole line. You kind of see how that works? Okay. Now, while mulattoes tend to have IQ scores in between blacks and whites, the creation of the mulattoes, who then label themselves black, doesn't reduce the black-white IQ gap much, because people who marry each other tend to have similar IQs. So let's say a white woman with an IQ of 92.5 has a baby with a black man with an IQ of 92.5. The whites lose 1 member of 92.5, raising the average of the remaining whites, while the blacks gain a member of 92.5, raising the average of the blacks. Right? Because the influx of someone with an IQ of 92.5 raises the average, because the average is 85, whereas whites losing someone with an IQ of 92.5, their average goes up because they're at 100. The 15-point black-white IQ gap has not changed on the aggregate, even if the scores of whites in the 1920s were the same as blacks in the 1960s and today. The Flynn Effect shows that there was room for improvement, but not that extant gaps are caused by environmental differences. They could be, right? I don't think they are, right? But theoretically they could be, but it doesn't follow from the Flynn Effect that the current gaps are caused by the environment. An example of this would be the male-female height gap. Women in England today are a little bit taller than men in England were in 1400, let's say. I'm just assuming. The improvements in nutrition and medicine account for people being taller today. However, women are shorter than men on aggregate today, and they were shorter in 1400. Now, is this because women have worse nutrition and medicine? Women eat less food than men, and women take smaller doses of medicine than men. Could this nutritional and medicinal deficiency be the cause of the male-female height gap? And if we look at what kinds of things black people read and what kinds of things white people read, we would find white people reading slightly more wordy and intellectual material. I mean, to generalize wildly, or not wildly, but to generalize. I'm not saying, right, that white people are best characterized as a race of intellectuals, just more so than blacks, right? Is this lack of intellectual material the cause of the black-white IQ gap? Or is it just that people who are more intellectual tend to be drawn toward intellectual pursuits? Right? That is, let's say that there is an innate intelligence gap. If you take people who are less intelligent innately by some standard of intelligence and you force them into intellectual pursuits, is that going to make them more intelligent by our subjective standard of intelligence? And is the lack of nutrition the cause of the male-female height gap? Do blacks lack access to intellectual material? Do women lack access to food? When people are told they are stupid, they tend to perform stupidly. In Claude Steele's study, Stereotype Threat and the Intellectual Test Performance of African Americans, Steele found that black and white college students, controlled for SAT scores, score about the same on an IQ test when told nothing, and blacks did worse on an IQ test when the test administrators brought up race and IQ. Basically, when they imply you're black, you're stupid, the blacks do worse. However, in this sample here, the blacks and whites in the sample had similar SAT scores going into that college, which in 1995 the SAT was still just a glorified IQ test. It is apparent to me that there was no stereotype threat during the administration of the SAT tests for those college students. Right. So getting into that college, and of course black performance in college is actually a little bit over predicted by the SAT tests. So obviously there was no stereotype threat during the administration of the SAT tests getting into that college. But the question is posed, is stereotype threat more omnipresent? Perhaps those blacks in college managed to escape and not be fazed by stereotype threat throughout their life, but that this stereotype threat plagues other blacks. I think not. And this is based on a survey done by David Williamson and the University of North Carolina titled, quote, "Despite common beliefs, study shows young blacks have higher self-esteem," close quote. And here's a little quote some quotes from the study. It says, "Differences in self-esteem were small but statistically significant considering the large number of studies included," she said. "The youngest black children, those under age 10, tended to have slightly lower scores than the youngest white children, but this difference disappeared as the children passed age 10. Provided that self-esteem scores for both black and white young people are equally variable with normal or bell-shaped distributions, our results suggest that the average young black person's self-esteem is higher than about 56% of white young people," she said. Put another way, the average black young person's self-esteem falls at about the 56th percentile of self-esteem for white children and adolescents. That's the end of that quote. Equalitarians, as I call them, like to point out the expectancy of the researchers. That is, the research data in one way or another is being skewed in favor of the bias of the researcher. Or that is, through the, however the data is gathered, the researcher is attempting in one way or another to gather the data that supports his hypothesis. Now, perhaps Steele's study, which showed a massive test score drop for college students, was subject to this expectancy. The reason I say this is because those college students were smart, and they knew how averages worked. Right? You have to know how averages work in order to get into college, at least with the SAT scores they had. They knew that black people scored lower on average. Like, this is just something that people know. They knew it all their life. Yet they managed to get into that college. And they just happened to score lower when a lower black score would be used as evidence for stereotype threat. If I wasn't clear enough, let me spell it out. It is absurd to think that Steele's study didn't involve fraud on the part of Steele and the students, because the students understood average inequality, yet managed to get into that college. These aren't little 6-year-old kids being told that having blue eyes means you're stupid. Right? That is, this study is probably fraudulent. But it doesn't matter anyway. Right? Assuming Steele and any other study trying to replicate the findings show that the presence of stereotype threat lowers scores, that doesn't mean stereotype threat is actually impacting scores outside of these studies, right? As Williamson showed. That is, just because, let me put it this way. Let's say you could show that hitting someone on their toe caused them to wobble as they walk. You look throughout the world and you find that white people on average are wobbling as they walk more than black people. Okay? That doesn't mean that the white people are wobbling because they got hit on the toes. Right? It could be an imbalance problem. That's just a little example I brought up on the fly. But anyway, showing that stereotype threat causes black people to have lower test scores, and the existence of black people having lower test scores doesn't mean that stereotype threat is causing the lower test scores. All right. Let's go a step further. Let's look at the environments that chimpanzees have in their habitat. No shelter, no written language. Humans came in and colonized their land that they objectively owned, and they drove them onto reservations. Some reservations were explicitly constructed even, and they were called zoos. Obviously it was their land, because they walked around all over it and ate things that grew on it, bugs and ants and berries and stuff, and whatever it is they eat. Right? And they did this for many generations, And while ownership is subjective, if walking around and consuming what nature provides and hunting stuff, right, and having campfires, if that doesn't constitute real legitimate ownership, well then I don't know what does. The standard of living for chimpanzees is abhorrent. They have no clothing, they run around naked, fighting is constant, and don't even get me started on the mortality rates of these tribal wars. They lack any dental or health care, and unemployment insurance is limited to tribal networks. They are illiterate, and their spoken language is lacking in nuance. But despite all this, there is still much that we, in our insulated and detached anthro society, can learn from their culture. They pick fleas off of each other's backs to provide food for each other. Entire clans of chimps are known to dive into a stream and save a drowning comrade, drowning themselves in the process. That's how much they care for one another. We can learn from this. Their humanity is visible. Because they behave this way, clearly this is how we should behave. Except instead of a natural tribe that anyone can leave, we should make 300 million people be forced to pay into a social insurance net, kind of like what these tribal societies are doing. could learn from them. Living in such deplorable conditions, why are we surprised that they are less intelligent by our anthrocentric definition of intelligence than us? Ignoring the possibility of test bias, the system of human privilege is visible. It's palpable. Chimps are in movies and in carnivals, pulling stunts to amuse the crowd, right? This grotesque, happy chimp caricature. It makes me retch. There have been attempts to have completely controlled environments, and even attempts to adopt chimps, to bring them in to human society, but the intergenerational effects of inequality between humans and chimps is not to be overcome overnight. Right? And some factors that may explain this chimp-human inequality are: 1. Test bias. While there are attempts to make the intelligence test, like trying to intelligence to a single number, right? There are attempts to make these intelligence tests more fair to chimpanzees. The fact that the test makers are human means bias is inherent, despite their best intentions. A second explanation would be environmentally triggered genes, right? Certain genes can be switched on or off in response to environmental effects, and these are not accounted for by the various species and pushing their specious pseudoscience. A third would be stereotype threat. There is a plethora of evidence that chimpanzees are very aware of the stereotype that they are less intelligent than humans. And this shows up when they are given a test in the presence of a human. And fourth, the IQ gaps between humans and chimps, they widen with age. Up until about age 3, humans and chimpanzees score similarly on intelligence tests, with chimpanzees scoring significantly higher on certain tests, like the ability to walk, ability to handle verbal commands, and deal with like silverware and stuff like that. And this shows that cultural influence plays a role later on, right? Because as the chimps become older, and these expectancies and these cultural effects, right? It's like magic. It's like in the air. Culture, it goes into their nostrils. I think that's my theory. The culture is a mist. It goes into the nostrils and it affects their brain. Right, and that happens, and as the chimp becomes older, the effect of culture begins to wear him down, and the human begins to pull away from the chimp, right? And that is why you have kind of parity early on, but then later the human pulls away from the chimp, right? Similarly, before puberty, boys and girls have similar physiques, right? And then later on, girls develop differently from boys, and that's just... That just shows the incredible power culture has in shaping a person, right? And in the case of the sexes, literally in shaping a person, as the cultural effects that cause girls and boys to go through puberty differently. While the speciesists like to cloak their arguments in scientific terminology, they are really bastardizing and putting forth the illusion of science. They lack the rigor and peer-reviewed thoroughness that characterizes real, genuine science. The science that occurs in state-funded and state-protected and tenured universities. I mean, can you even think of any conflict of interest? A highly politicized, highly cartelized university where your faculty members can decide where the opinion of your faculty members have a great impact on your professional career. What possible motives could people in this environment have to saying anything other than the truth while the political zeitgeist is in favor of equality? What? I can't see anything. It is shameful that so many are still falling for what should be clearly transparent speciesism. Okay, I thought that was a good little parody. Obviously, the gap between blacks and whites is nowhere near the magnitude of humans and chimps. It's so small, in fact, that people can only really perceive a black-white, intelligence or IQ gap after interacting with hundreds of members of another race or through looking at the statistics, right? It's not like chimps where where you can come into contact with a single chimp and realize, okay, this species is less intelligent. No, with blacks and whites, the overlap, there's a great deal of overlap. Yeah, that's a good way to say it. There's really no overlap between humans and chimps except for humans with problems. But the arguments against scientific speciesism that I put forward and scientific racism are similar in kind, right? It's just a different degree. Right now, I'm talking about blacks and whites because of politics, right? Just because of the political implications. But this goes beyond race. Okay, humans are just animals. And dumb people existing in dumb environments is analogous to animals living in environments without even shelter or spoken language, right? I'm sure if you adopt a dog and you train it, a human can cause a dog to be smarter, right? And that the environment that dogs live in naturally make them less intelligent by our standards of intelligence. But that's not right. But that doesn't mean that the difference in environment is what causes the entire dog-human intelligence gap. When I see a dumb person in a dirty car driving slow, I just see a less extreme version of a chimpanzee. It's all on a continuum, right? You can teach a chimp some things, but there are some things that a chimpanzee simply will not get. Similarly, with a human with low intelligence, you can teach them some things, but there are some things that they simply will not get. Equality. What false and sentimental tripe. Now, I'm not some social Darwinist or eugenicist, right? I'm not placing any value judgments on these things. But genetically determined inequality between individuals and groups is a fact of physical reality.